Hello and greetings. This is Train Time, the podcast, and it really is train time, even here in the United States. I'm Karen Christensen, and I started the Train Campaign, a project of the Barrington Institute, in 2011. I began recording interviews with politicians and train activists in 2017, most in the U.S., but sometimes looking to projects in other parts of the world. I hope you'll subscribe to Train Time and also send me your questions and suggestions. And visit our YouTube channel, Train Campaign, for some great interviews and amazing historical footage. Well, I'm Karen Christensen, and I'm going to record a podcast today that I have wanted to do for ages and have hesitated because I've worried that it's going to be too technical. Lots of complicated numbers and lots of stuff that people are going to argue with me over, because I don't intend to pull any punches here. One of the great pleasures of not running the Train Campaign in quite the same way that I did before is I feel I can speak more freely about some of the things I've seen and some of the things I've learned about that I think that you as a citizen, whether you're in the United States or elsewhere, will be concerned about. And I'm hoping that you'll agree with me that we need to do some things differently in this country if we are to have the kind of public transportation that we deserve and that we need. Everybody knows what a boondoggle project is, a highway to nowhere, an airport built just so some politician can get to his or her country retreat. But that is not the only way taxpayer dollars, your dollars, are wasted. They are wasted on $25 million train stations, on $2 million studies that then get stored on a shelf next to other studies. When I first started working on rail, I met a wonderful fellow in the Pioneer Valley who told me, he warned me. He said, those people in Boston, they love studies. They think they look so nice on the shelf, especially if they're color-coded. Our tax dollars are wasted on efforts that are designed to go nowhere, to never mean a shovel in the ground. They're wasted on studies that pour money into huge consulting firms' bank accounts. And they're used to prove that rail projects, public transit projects, are impossible or often so expensive as to be untenable. This is how politicians and bureaucrats like the departments of transportation and consulting firms make sure that it's always business as usual. But it's time to do things differently. It's train time. That's our motto or a slogan. It's train time. And it's time for government here, too, to lead in innovation for the world we actually live in, not for the 20th century. The challenge of climate change is upon us. 20th century solutions will not work. So we keep talking about spending vast sums on infrastructure. There's been a lot about that during the Biden administration and a lot of money spent. But instead of 21st century solutions, most of the transportation spending continues to be directed toward gas-guzzling highways, cash-guzzling commuter transit systems, and toward Amtrak. Amtrak was a fine thing. In 1971, it preserved some of America's passenger train routes, but this is 2025, the 21st century. And Amtrak, as far as I'm concerned, is still focused on the 20th century. We can talk about high-speed trains another time. It is another issue. I'm not entirely convinced, as you will see. I think that there is low-hanging fruit, and that is where money should go, to help more people and far more quickly. I absolutely believe we should be spending money on our public transportation and not pouring it into highways and roads. The New York City congestion charge that's just started, it's a great step. But things need to change. We need to enter the 21st century before it's over. And money is really at the core of it, where the money's going, whose pocket it's going into. The Transit Costs Project at NYU, as well as a major study by the Regional Plan Association a few years ago, have both found that U.S. transit projects cost between 2 and 10 times as much as comparable projects in other countries, even after taking all labor and other factors into account. And it's my firm belief that just because something should be done does not mean it needs to be done in the most expensive way possible. I'm often reminded of my English boyfriend, who was a cycling fanatic. He offered to build me a custom bike and asked if I would pay for it. He said, "But I need to tell you, you have a choice. It could be expensive, or it could be very expensive." And of course, it was very expensive. And this is something we need to face as a nation. We're desperately in need of infrastructure improvements of all kinds: bridges, roads, our water system, our electrical system. In my neighborhood in Massachusetts, the water and sewer pipes are failing. They're made out of all kinds of, there's different generations of failure. The kind from the 40s and 50s is some kind of composite material that's collapsing. You go back to older houses, these terracotta things, they seem to be a bit more resilient, but they're breaking too. And it's not quite clear that anyone knows exactly where those pipes are. So all of these things cost money, and a lot of money, no question. But unless we start managing these costs more efficiently and with more transparency, there is absolutely no way that we can, even with trillions of dollars, do everything that needs to be done. And the kind of budgeting that is currently done by many state and regional governments and agencies makes it really easy to sink important transit projects. There is a movement by conservatives to keep money from going to any kind of public transportation. Even though we do have some leaders, Jim Alozzi of Massachusetts is one. I'll just read a quote from him. There are a few people who understand this, but we still are not seeing the shift. I have not seen, even during the 4 years of the Biden administration, seen anything like the shift that we need to make if we are actually to confront and solve these problems. But Jim Alozzi said, "I think the federal government has every right to say, look, it's our money, and we are now in the process of redirecting and transitioning from a 1950s approach to something that more clearly reflects not just the moment, but the future." That is certainly spot on. But are we actually seeing an approach that reflects the future? I don't think we're getting there. Just a few examples. I'm going to give you a few examples, food for thought. Even the stations. Now, you would think that a train station, as they were in the old days, you can see one train station after another along a line, and they look quite similar. They're done to the same pattern. They were not moved there on trucks, but somebody had a pattern. And there were some basic rules in terms of size and proportion, materials, and the uses that they needed to be designed for, and they built them. But the Hartford line and Connecticut stations, Berlin, Meriden, and Wallingford, they cost over $25 million each, which is a huge amount more, said my Connecticut connection, than stations in Massachusetts. He felt that we were being quite relatively economical here. There's a station plan in Enfield, Connecticut, $32 million. But here in Massachusetts, $4 million was allocated simply for the design of a station at Palmer, which is a relatively small place, but would serve the Pioneer Valley, where the Five College area in Western Massachusetts. $4 million for a station study. There was a station study done in Berkshire County for 5 different towns all sorts of mapping of wetlands and the downtown areas and the outlying areas for $250,000. So something's awry here. This is not rational allocation of funds. And here's another example. This is to do with the North-South Rail Link, something in Boston that has had the most staggering differences in prices from all, the opponents of it in the in-state government have claimed it would be, that the price went up. I don't know, it was $21 billion or something a few years ago. But this is the kind of detail that one finds. So this particular article said that the most prominent failure of the report on the North-South Rail Link is its approach to electrification. In order to avoid burdening the study with added costs, the scope of the study presumes only electrifying up to the first station on each line beyond the tunnel. In practice, this assumption of bare minimum additional improvements imposes higher operating and capital costs than a north-south rail link built after or concurrently with system-wide electrification. The dual-mode locomotives, which would be required under this assumption, are extraordinarily expensive and built by few vendors, adding $2.5 billion to the project estimate. This is typical of planning, and it's typical of the complete lack of critical path thinking and systems thinking in transportation. Now, you would think that transportation, of all things, would be a place where you would see systems approach applied over and over again, because after all, transportation is a system connecting lots and lots of points in lots and lots of different ways. But no, it will be A to B. All kinds of, important things are left out. Studies do not bring in benefits, especially when you get engineers. I love engineers. Engineers are a wonderful breed and very important. But if you bring in engineers to look at a rail project, they look at how much at the mechanics of it and how much it will cost. They are not people who will think about what it will mean to businesses, what it will mean to individuals, what it will mean in terms of the social fabric. And those things sometimes are hard to quantify, but not always. There's a lot that can be quantified, certainly when it comes to economic development potential. There's tons of data. But here's my absolute favorite passage from a report on public transportation. This one came in April 2020. So when we were all sort of locked up. It comes from a nonprofit organization in Massachusetts called Transit Matters. And they were commenting on a study that was done for the Massachusetts Department of Transportation on proposed upgrade to the east-west line, the line across Massachusetts. Now, there is a train line there. It runs freight trains. It runs one passenger train per day. It is an existing operating passenger rail line. But the idea is to upgrade it to increase the speed. So there would be high-speed rail, at least on part of it, and have much more frequent service. This is the idea, because right now you can take the train to Boston, but you can't get back. Gets you there in the evening. Anyway, the times are really inconvenient. But the rail's there, and it runs passenger trains. So keep this in mind. And my favorite line, I'll quote this and then I'll read you more of the material. And I do apologize. It's going to get a little dense. I hope I can get some of it across this way. And obviously we'll be posting the actual links to the reports. But what they said, rather tongue-in-cheek, they said, we believe that the $2 billion infrastructure figure for Alternative 2 in the report is too high by approximately $2 billion. And then they took a critical look at the study and found some potential flaws in it that they examined using available data. And their conclusion was that the study overestimated the cost to run the rail service and underestimated potential passenger traffic. The study also spent considerable resources examining a high-speed rail link between Boston and Worcester along the turnpike. That's the Massachusetts Turnpike, the right-of-way. That is the land on which the rail exists and where there's a legal right to build and run trains. The study looked at high speed despite exorbitant costs and grades, i.e., elevation grades, that would preclude railroad operation. So they assumed that the alternative 6 is not feasible and merits no further mention. Their analysis focused on a less expensive, I can't remember how many billions of dollars that was estimated at, but they were looking at one that would be a slightly more than 2 hour or 2.25 hour trip between Boston and Springfield with stops at Worcester and Palmer, which I just mentioned, and 6 round trips a day, which would be great. And then connecting bus service to Pittsfield, which people out here where I live don't like at all. But according to the consultant's proposal, to achieve this travel time would require nearly $2 billion in capital expenditure and on annual operating costs, cost to the taxpayer, of $42 million, while other alternatives required even a higher capital outlay. Where Transit Matters was proposing, they said, we believe that several round trips can be made on the Boston to Springfield Railroad in little more than 2 hours without procuring any additional rolling stock using existing railroad infrastructure. Therefore, we believe that the $2 billion infrastructure figure for Alternative 2 is too high by approximately $2 billion. And what they proposed is a way to use existing equipment. That is the train carriages themselves, the engine and the carriages that we ride. And equipment is obviously, as well as staff, is crucial to running a train service. And we have to keep in mind this line does already carry passenger trains. So their proposal is in the first phase, 2 trains in the morning and 2 in the evening would be extended from Worcester to Springfield. This would provide a skeleton service which when combined with existing Amtrak service, the Lakeshore Limited, would mean 3 round trips between Boston and Springfield daily. Connections could be provided for most service with existing routes, with the potential to add additional bus service to Amherst, which is north of Springfield, and then they point out that this would require additional agreement with the freight company CSX, but minimal capital outlay and a net of nearly zero in operating costs, though it would require establishing a crew base in Springfield or putting up crews overnight. So in transport terms, a very modest cost. And then they suggest a phase 1A service to Pittsfield option. Another early action item would be to extend train 552 and 557 to and from Pittsfield, providing a second trip to and from Pittsfield each day. This would require additional track and dispatching rights on the CSX route west of Springfield, as well as layover space in Pittsfield itself, though it is possible that this could take place on the track adjacent to the platform there. This would probably also allow at least 1 weekend round trip on a schedule similar to the weekday trip, although with a later morning departure and potentially later evening departure. Since the train would otherwise spend the entire weekend in Pittsfield. With trains and with equipment, it's really important to have them in the right place for the next trip you're going to run. So you have to think about, putting in sometimes an extra service just to get the trains and possibly the staff to where you want to have them the next morning. Again, this would require access to the CSX line. A second phase they're suggesting would be a full schedule to Springfield with 5 new round trips each day. That would incorporate a full schedule as described earlier, and then additional bus and or rail connections between Amherst and Pittsfield, north and then west, and the weekend service. And additional train sets would not be necessary, but some investment in rolling stock could be required. This would be considered a full build option and would require significant dispatching rights from CSX and likely require a capital outlay for the state to purchase the railroad. I assume that. I'm not sure if they can't mean the railroad. CSX is a big firm, but perhaps some portion of the line of CSX owns it. And I hope you see now that this stuff is complicated. The dispatching of trains means just saying, keeping track, telling them that they can take off and they need to stop and wait for some other train. And although by law, passenger trains in the United States have priority, in actuality, they don't. In part because I'm told that freight companies like CSX often have the right to do the dispatching. And obviously, you see that gives them essentially complete control where that's the case. Then we talk about Pittsfield, which is the central town in Berkshire County, the far west of Massachusetts, which is where I live, and certainly people here want they do not want bus service to Springfield and then a change. They really would like to see more trains from Pittsfield into Boston. But what Transit Matters suggested was that additional phases could include through routing more trains to Greenfield, that's north, Pittsfield, west, or having through routed trains to New Haven, which is south of Springfield. I'll have to put a map up with this podcast. This is actually getting some attention. I think it's called the Compass Rail by the state DOT now. There is more attention being placed on a route that would go from Boston to Springfield and then down to New Haven, which makes sense because of population. Population does matter. We really are believers in rural equity and the fact that if you improve public transportation in areas that are more remote, you make them less remote and give them far more potential for economic growth and community stability, population stability as well. So these things are really very important. But what Transit Matters points out here is that adding additional service west of Worcester would require the installation of positive train control. That is a security system, and there are very specific regulations governing when it is required. It has to do with speed and the frequency of trains. So that is always a factor. It's one of the planning factors because it adds cost. It's obviously absolutely necessary in many cases, but it needs to be considered just as insurance needs to be considered. These are all, practical factors that all need to be addressed as you put in a service. And the simpler, I'm very much aimed at looking for the simplest, the lowest hanging fruit, the things that can be done relatively quickly, especially to show that they can be done and to show that people will use them. Give people a chance to see what it means to be able to take the train. So some of these things would need to be done in phases because there's the issue of single track segments and whether you can double them or create new sidings. That is, trains can easily pass if they have proper control by computer or dispatchers, and one train goes into a siding and the other passes it. So there are lots and lots of places where there is a single track, but trains going both directions. That has been the case for 200 years. I want to mention now another study that was done in Massachusetts for what is called the Northern Tier line, which is quite similar to the Berkshire line that I've worked so much on, which it goes from, it did used to go from New York all the way to Pittsfield, Massachusetts. What they call the Northern Tier, there certainly was passenger service there, though I'm not sure if it had a particular name. But that's going in Boston instead of going straight across the east-west high-speed rail, that's where we have a major highway going through. But the Northern Tier cuts up towards the northwest corner of Massachusetts and goes in the west through hilly and quite sparsely populated area of small towns and farms that would really like to have train service to Boston, quite understandably, and then to a couple of larger towns, to North Adams in particular, which is an old manufacturing town. But I was looking at the numbers in this study, and the numbers for this route that were provided by the consultants that I'm not sure how much money was spent on that study. I don't think it was even as much as what was allocated for the study of the Palmer train station. But they proposed that to bring passenger service to that corridor would cost $1 to $3 billion. And in the by far the longest stretch of it in the west, they've divided it into the west, central, and east, has only 107,000 people. And the middle section, which takes you almost back to the kind of getting on close to Boston, is 237,000 people. $1.3 billion for that number of people is a questionable outlay. So here's the thing. The question to ask is not simply whether that would be a good investment of taxpayer dollars compared to other things that the money could be spent on. We can factor in social equity, of course, potential for economic development in a part of the state that really could use some help. The important question in my mind is whether there's any real chance that will ever be funded. Or is all the money spent on the study simply a way to get those rural community activists to shut up, or a way for the politicians to say, oh, we tried? That's certainly my read of it. I'd be glad to hear what you think. And I'd be very interested to hear what you think of the lightweight solutions, the solutions that could be put into action immediately, like the proposal made by Transit Matters. Thanks very much for listening. You'll find a lot of links in the show notes to this podcast, and you will be able to comment, and you're very welcome to send me an email, Karen@barringtoninstitute.org. Thanks for joining me at Train Time. Don't forget to subscribe. Send me your suggestions for future shows, and visit our YouTube channel, Train Campaign, for some great interviews and amazing historical footage, including a bit from the documentary The Last Train to Pittsfield, filmed in 1971.